In the Colosseum, there were two gates, and every gladiator knew that entering through the wrong one meant he was already dead before he fell. But the gate was only the most obvious detail. Behind those walls operated a machine so precise, so calculated, and so brutal that it turned death into ritual, ritual into power, and power into absolute control over 50,000 people at the same time. Rome did not invent violence, it organized it, packaged it, and sold it with tickets. And what no one tells you is that this machine never stopped, it only changed form. There was a detail in the Colosseum that very few people know, and one that completely changes how you see that place. There were two main entrances to the arena, the Gate of Life to the east and the Gate of Death to the west. Through the Gate of Life entered the gladiators, ready for combat, filled with adrenaline as the roar of the crowd echoed through the stone corridors. Through the Gate of Death, however, came what remained after the spectacle ended. Bodies dragged away, the wounded still gasping, slaughtered animals. From its very foundation, the Colosseum made clear the contract it had with anyone who stepped onto that sand. What makes this detail even more disturbing is the level of awareness a wounded gladiator had throughout the entire process. When a fighter fell but was still breathing, attendants would enter the arena and drag him to the center, while tens of thousands of voices decided his fate with a simple gesture. There was no appeal, no lawyer, no second chance, only the will of a crowd inflamed by blood and sun. A man's life in that moment was worth exactly as much as the audience was entertained. It is hard to imagine a more brutal situation than having your existence decided by an arena full of strangers. And what is even more striking is that none of this was chaos, it was ritual. The public executions that followed the combats were staged with precision, deliberately prolonging suffering, as if death itself needed a specific duration to satisfy the audience. There was a dark logic behind every step: the entrance, the fight, the fall, the judgment, the exit, all timed like a high-level theatrical performance. To truly understand the Colosseum, one must abandon the idea that it was primitive or disorganized. It was in fact the opposite, a carefully engineered system designed to turn violence into mass entertainment. This brutal ritual reveals something far beyond Roman cruelty. It shows that behind all that blood and sand existed a calculated, almost scientific system of managing human emotions. Rome did not invent violence, it organized it, packaged it, and sold it with tickets. Every detail, from the Gate of Death to the gesture of the crowd, was part of a larger structure, one that required far more than gladiators and lions to function. And it is precisely this structure that begins to reveal the true scale of what was built there. And to turn death into a spectacle of that magnitude, Rome had to build something the world had never seen before. The Flavian Amphitheater, only later known as the Colosseum, was erected between 72 and 80 AD and could hold more than 50,000 people in its stone and marble stands. It was not just a stadium, it was a statement in architectural form, a message carved in stone for anyone who dared question Rome's power. Emperors like Vespasian and Titus did not build that monument out of love for engineering or the arts. They built it because they understood that a restless, hungry population with no prospects was a ticking bomb, and the Colosseum was the most sophisticated defusal mechanism ever created. What few people realize is where the wealth that financed all of this came from. Much of the funding for the Colosseum came directly from the plunder of Jerusalem following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Gold, treasures, sacred objects, and tens of thousands of Jewish prisoners were brought to Rome as spoils of war, and it was with this capital of blood and conquest that the foundations of the amphitheater were laid. Slave labor completed the equation. Human bodies replaced machines. carrying stones, digging foundations, and raising the stands where later other human beings would watch the deaths of their own kind. The historical irony is almost unbearable. Every spectacle held inside the Colosseum was not just entertainment, it was a renewal of the contract between the emperor and the people. When Titus inaugurated the amphitheater with 100 consecutive days of games, he was not celebrating architecture, he was buying loyalty, silencing criticism, and demonstrating that imperial power could offer something no rival senator or general could: absolute grandeur. It is the same principle that governments around the world still use today, in different forms: large events, national celebrations, public spectacles that divert attention from what is truly happening behind the scenes of power. Rome was simply more transparent about it. The Colosseum, therefore, was born as a political tool before it was anything else, and every stone stacked there carried the weight of calculated intent. Controlling 50,000 people in a single space required more than structural capacity. It required absolute control over who sat where, who saw what, and who felt part of something greater than themselves. And it is precisely here that the design of the Colosseum reveals its most intelligent layer, because control was not only in the walls, it was in the seats themselves. If the Colosseum was a tool of control, then its seating was the instruction manual. The system of seat distribution inside the amphitheater was as rigidly hierarchical as Roman society itself, and that was no coincidence. Senators and members of the elite occupied the front rows closest to the arena, where the smell of blood and the view of combats was most intense and privileged. In the middle sat ordinary citizens, merchants, and veteran soldiers. At the very top, in the highest tiers with the worst possible view, were the poor, the enslaved, and most often women. Rome did not need speeches about social hierarchy, it built it in stone and displayed it to 50,000 people at once. The most revealing aspect of this social architecture was the emotional effect it had on those present. An ordinary citizen could go their entire life without ever sharing the same space as a Roman senator, except there, in the Colosseum, where differences were exposed in a raw and deliberate way. It was not inclusion, it was a carefully maintained illusion that everyone belonged to the same empire, the same spectacle, the same greatness. Those in the upper tiers had poor visibility, endured the sun, and lacked comfort, yet they were still kept there, because their presence reinforced the narrative that Rome was vast enough to include everyone, even in vastly different positions. This logic is not so distant from the modern world. Think about how major events today, concerts, championship finals, political ceremonies, still replicate this exact structure. The richest in front with exclusive boxes and comfort, everyone else behind, crowded yet still present and participating in the same collective narrative. The Colosseum simply made this visible in a way no previous civilization had dared to do so. To study this system is to understand that inequity does not always need to be hidden. It can be displayed as part of the spectacle, as long as everyone feels, in some way, included within it. The Colosseum, therefore, did more than entertain, it instructed. With every visit, it taught each person their place in the order of the Roman world. And while the crowd above the arena floor was perfectly organized and stratified, something even more elaborate and darker was being built beneath it, an underground world that few in the audience could even imagine existed. Few spectators sitting in those stands had any idea what was happening just a few meters beneath their feet. The hypogeum, the name given to the Colosseum's underground network, was a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, corridors, and mechanisms built years after the amphitheater's inauguration, completely transforming the scale of Roman spectacles. Down there, in near total darkness, Gladiators waited for their turn to enter the arena, hearing only the deafening roar of the crowd above, without truly knowing what awaited them on the other side of the trap door. It was an environment designed not for comfort, but for maximum tension, where time moved slowly and every minute of waiting weighed like a stone on the chest. And it wasn't only men who inhabited that underworld. Exotic animals brought from every corner of the empire, lions from Africa, tigers from Asia, bears from Germania, elephants from the east, were confined in tight cages for days, deliberately deprived of food. The logic was simple and brutal. A hungry animal is an aggressive animal, and an aggressive animal guarantees a spectacle. The handlers who cared for these beasts worked in a constant balance between necessity and danger, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. The hypogeum was at once a zoo, a prison, and a stage, all operating in unison so the audience above would never have to wait long between one thrill and the next. What makes the system even more impressive is the level of coordination it required. Every surprise appearance in the arena, whether a gladiator, a wild beast, or an entire set, was the result of meticulous planning executed by hundreds of invisible workers. Signals were exchanged, mechanisms activated, platforms raised and lowered with precise timing. Nothing was improvised. Everything was rehearsed like a grand theatrical production, with the difference that the actors could truly die. The audience saw magic, but behind the scenes there was sweat, risk, and an organization that rivaled any military operation of the time. The hypogeum revealed that the Colosseum was far more than an arena. It was a living machine, breathing beneath the sand, capable of turning the impossible into routine. And it was precisely this ability to surprise, to create the unimaginable before 50,000 eyes, that pushed Rome even further. Because if it was possible to make men and beasts emerge from the ground as if by enchantment, why not attempt something even more extraordinary, like transforming the arena itself into a naval battlefield? If the hypogeum represented Rome's mastery over the land and what lay beneath it, the Naumachie represented its control over something even more ambitious, the water itself. Before the construction of the underground system, the Colosseum's arena could be flooded through a sophisticated network connected to Roman aqueducts, transforming the sandy floor into an aquatic stage capable of hosting staged naval battles with real ships. These were not models or symbolic representations. They were actual vessels crewed by real men fighting in real water inside a packed amphitheater. The level of technical and logistical ambition behind this is difficult to grasp even through a 21st century lens. What makes the Naumachie particularly dark is who filled those ships. Unlike gladiators, who had training, social status, and even devoted fans, the fighters in these naval battles were mostly prisoners of war condemned to death, with no choice, no glory, and no real chance of survival. They boarded those ships knowing the spectacle would only end when enough blood had stained that artificial water. There were no contracts, no trainers, no crowds chanting their names, only the sound of oars, the stench of stagnant water, and the certainty that it would be their final day. Rome used them as raw material for entertainment and discarded them with the same indifference as a torch being extinguished. The demand for ever more grandiose spectacles was the engine that drove the Colosseum's technical evolution over the decades. Each time the audience grew accustomed to a certain level of spectacle, the pressure to surpass it increased, and Rome responded with more engineering, more resources, and, inevitably, more brutality. It's a logic anyone can recognize intuitively. What shocks today becomes ordinary tomorrow, and the appetite for more intense sensations keeps growing. Rome simply lived this equation in its most extreme form, with human lives as the currency. The Naumachia came to an end once the hypogeum was built. After all, it's impossible to maintain underground tunnels and a flooded arena at the same time. But the spirit behind them endured, the relentless pursuit of making the impossible seem routine, of turning engineering into illusion and illusion into power. And it was precisely this pursuit that led Roman engineers and architects to develop one of the most sophisticated mechanical systems of antiquity. A system that made men and beasts appear out of nowhere, as if the very ground of the arena were alive. Behind every spectacular appearance in the arena, there was something the audience would never see, and that was precisely what made the magic possible. The Colosseum operated with dozens of elevators and trapdoors strategically distributed across the arena floor, all connected to an intricate system of pulleys, counterweights, and reinforced wooden tracks. Hundreds of workers, mostly slaves, were positioned in the corridors of the hypogeum, manually turning mechanisms, pushing platforms, and controlling the timing of each entrance with a level of precision that bordered on the absurd for a civilization without digital technology. When a starving lion emerged from beneath the sand, seemingly out of nowhere, there were dozens of invisible men who made that moment possible. The coordination required by this system was comparable to that of a large modern film production, with the brutal difference that a miscalculation didn't mean a scene being cut in editing, but death in real time. If a platform rose too early, an operator could be crushed. If a mechanism jammed at the wrong moment, a gladiator could be trapped between the underground and the arena, exposed and vulnerable. The backstage of the Colosseum was just as dangerous as the main stage, and the workers who operated that machine lived under constant pressure, without recognition, without applause, and without the slightest chance that the crowd would ever know they existed. It's impossible not to draw a connection to the modern world when thinking about this. Large-scale productions, whether a rock concert with a rotating stage, an Olympic opening ceremony, or an action film with special effects, operate under exactly the same logic. The spectacle exists so the audience does not see the effort. The illusion is the final product, and the more invisible the work behind it, the more powerful it becomes. Rome understood this 2,000 years before Hollywood existed and built an entertainment industry powered by wooden mechanisms, human muscle, and a level of ingenuity that still impresses engineers and historians today. The Colosseum had therefore become a machine of illusions on an industrial scale, where the audience saw gods, monsters, and epic battles, while behind the scenes there was exhaustion, risk, and lives being consumed in silence. But all this engineering was not meant merely to impress or entertain. It served a far more calculated and cold purpose. Because keeping 50,000 people fascinated, controlled, and politically docile required more than mechanical tricks. It required a complete strategy of domination that extended far beyond the walls of the amphitheater. Rome understood something that few empires had the clarity to openly admit. An entertained population is a controlled population. The Colosseum offered far more than combat and death. It provided comfort, a sense of belonging, and the feeling of being part of something grand. One of the most impressive examples of this was the Velarium, a Vishal system of linen awnings operated by hundreds of specially trained sailors, which covered much of the seating and protected the audience from Rome's scorching sun. It was not a minor detail. It was a clear message that the empire cared about the well-being of its people, at least enough to keep them seated and quiet for hours while watching staged deaths. The expression bread and circuses, coined by the Roman poet Juvenal, was never more literal than inside the Colosseum. While the elite watched death in comfort with privileged views, the common people received free entertainment, occasional food distribution, and the collective illusion that everyone shared in the same imperial greatness. It was a silent and efficient exchange. The government provided distraction, and the people offered political passivity in return. Economic crises, scandals in the Senate, poorly conducted wars on the frontiers, all of this temporarily faded into the background when the gates of the Colosseum opened and the roar of the crowd filled the air. The spectacle did not merely entertain, it numbed. This mechanism of social control through entertainment is one of Rome's most relevant and unsettling legacies, because it never truly disappeared. One only needs to observe how major sporting events, social media algorithms, and mass entertainment productions function today to realize that the Roman logic is more alive than ever. The difference is that the modern circus fits in the palm of your hand and is available 24 hours a day. For those who want to explore this idea further, works such as The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord and Brave New World by Aldous Huxley examine this dynamic with unsettling clarity and can make readers see the world in a completely different way. The Colosseum was therefore much more than an amphitheater. It was a political weapon of surgical precision, capable of keeping Rome stable through ritualized violence, calculated comfort, and collective illusion. But every machine fueled by blood demands a price over time, and Rome, no matter how vast and powerful, did not escape that cost, because nothing lasts forever, not even the greatest spectacle ever created by humanity. And what happened to the Colosseum over the centuries reveals something deep and unsettling about the nature of power and about ourselves. For nearly 500 years, the Colosseum functioned as the beating heart of Rome, and then, gradually, it fell silent. The games did not end with a dramatic decree or a popular revolution. They simply lost momentum, the stands emptied, and they ceased to make sense within an empire undergoing profound transformation. The same audience that once cheered for death and filled those stone tiers to the brim began to stop attending, not because violence had disappeared from the world, but because values, power structures, and forms of entertainment were changing. Empires do not die all at once. They dissolve slowly, like salt in water, until one day someone realizes that what once existed is no longer there. The most revealing detail of this decline is the reason behind it. The Colosseum was not abandoned because Roman society experienced a collective moral awakening or because someone decided it was too wrong to continue. It was abandoned because it ceased to be useful to those in power. When the empire fragmented, resources grew scarce and new forms of social control emerged. The amphitheater lost its political function, and without that function, it was merely a massive stone structure in the middle of a collapsing city. Morality had little to do with it. Utility had everything. It's an uncomfortable lesson about how great human structures rarely fall because they are unjust. They fall when they are no longer convenient. The physical ruin of the Colosseum tells an equally fascinating story. Much of the marble, stone, and metal that once adorned the amphitheater was removed during the Middle Ages to build churches, palaces, and bridges in Rome, including, ironically, parts of the Vatican. The same monument built with gold looted from Jerusalem was centuries later dismantled to construct the symbols of a new faith. History carries a sense of irony that no writer could surpass. What remains is the skeleton we see today, imposing, incomplete, and still capable of evoking both admiration and unease. The true legacy of the Colosseum does not lie in its ruins, it lies in the mirror it represents. Because that structure does not only tell us something about Rome, it tells us something about what happens when power, technology, and entertainment converge without moral restraint, and about the price that is always paid by someone in that equation. That price was exacted from gladiators, slaves, prisoners, and animals who never had a choice. And the question that remains, silent and persistent, is whether the arenas have changed in form or merely become more sophisticated and less obvious.
The Colosseum was not just a building, it was a mirror, and what it reflected was not only the greatness of Rome, but the human capacity to turn anything, even death, into product, control, and narrative. For nearly 500 years, those stone walls absorbed the blood of gladiators, the roar of crowds, and the cold calculations of emperors who knew exactly what they were doing. And when it all came to an end, it wasn't because someone woke up with a guilty conscience, it was because the system simply found new ways to continue. Now, the question that remains is not about Rome, it's about today. How many modern arenas operate under the same logic, offering spectacle in exchange for passivity, distraction in exchange for obedience, entertainment in exchange for political silence? Who are the gladiators of the 21st century? Who operates the invisible mechanisms that make the illusion work? These questions are unsettling precisely because the answers are closer than anyone would like to admit. The story of Rome did not end, it simply changed its clothes. If this content sparked something in you, a doubt, a connection, a sense of unease, then it has fulfilled its purpose. Let me know in the comments, which part of the Colosseum surprised you the most? Do you think bread and circuses still works today? Your response might be the beginning of a conversation far more valuable than any Roman spectacle. And if you want to keep diving into the darkest, most fascinating, and forgotten stories of the Roman Empire, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because there's much more coming and you won't want to miss a single chapter of this story.